Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Dissenter Weekly Update for April 9th, 2020. I'm Kevin Gosztola, the managing editor for Shadowproof.com. Parts of the United States have been in quarantine now for nearly a month. There's deaths and infection rates that remain high in the US and other parts of the world. Yet again, that is the backdrop for our whistleblower stories for the week. But first, Brian has some housekeeping items for you.
Yes, hello everybody, this is Brian. Please just remember to subscribe to our channel on YouTube and like us on Facebook so that you can get alerts for our show and keep up with what we're doing here. And if you like what we're doing and you have the ability to, please go to shadowproof.com/donate and chip in. We're 100% reader supported. We know that a lot of people are struggling out there in this time, so if you can't, that's okay. But if you can help us, we'd really appreciate it. So with that, I think we should dive right in. We have the 1-year anniversary that Julian Assange was arrested and jailed. What would you like to tell us about this, the significance of this, Kevin?
Well, I just wanted to mark, and it seemed like a significant development because Julian Assange remains in jail at the Her Majesty's Belmarsh prison. And there, again, as we've spoken about for the past few weeks, he is under threat of coronavirus. He has a chronic lung infection. The attorneys for him told a judge that they'd be willing to have him electronically tagged and he could be placed under house arrest. They really want to have his safety protected, and they have questions about the transparency of the Belmarsh prison. There's been some staff who had contracted the virus or tested positive for the coronavirus, and yet it's unclear what is being done to protect prisoners like Julian Assange. And that's not unique to Belmarsh. We're seeing that throughout the globe, that prisoners are the most vulnerable, some of the most vulnerable people during this pandemic. In addition, there was a hearing in the past week, and it was apparently said that Julian Assange was unwell, and that was why he was not appearing during that hearing. And it's not really clear what they meant by unwell. And I don't want to start any rumors, but I think given what's going on in the world with the pandemic, anyone who is ill at this moment, you'd have to be concerned as to why exactly they aren't feeling well, and were they being tested, and is there any kind of monitoring being done to look after them to make sure that it isn't something more serious than just the average cold or whatever he might be going through. So there was this hearing, and it was a case management hearing. There was one development that is kind of a sidebar issue, but there's something going on related to keeping a partner of his anonymous, and apparently this partner submitted some evidence to the court, and the judge was reluctant, or I guess refused to grant anonymity, and that's being litigated. Has not been resolved at the moment as we're recording this show on April 9th. But more significantly to me is the fact that they went before the judge, his legal team, and asked for a postponement of the extradition hearing that's upcoming in May, this 3-week extradition hearing. And Judge Vanessa Baratzer basically decided that she could not say for certain whether there would be a court in May or not. She didn't know how much longer the coronavirus outbreak would have the United Kingdom on lockdown, and so she wasn't going to move the hearing. And that seems kind of backward, because if you don't really know, why not postpone it until September so that everyone, both sides, can do the right preparations? Both sides are going to have witnesses that they would like to call for this 3-week hearing. It's going to be an evidentiary hearing, and yet she's suggesting that there's no reason to scrap these plans because of the coronavirus. It's really boggles the mind that she would do that. I mean, on one hand, it boggles the mind that she won't release him from prison. But on the other hand, it boggles the mind that she wants to keep this date because if you look at news, the latest development in the UK is that they're considering extending the order to keep people at home or to shelter in place through May. And so inevitably, you can imagine she's going to have to postpone. So why not be proactive? And I think her failure to be proactive just speaks to how you've had examples all along the way of Vanessa Baratzer's failure to protect the rights of the accused, whether we're talking about keeping him in the glass box at the back of the courtroom and not allowing him to sit with his legal team, or whether we're talking about not doing much to step in so he has more access to his attorneys. We've had complaints all along the way about how his rights are being violated, and she's been really weak in her responses in trying to protect him, and put a lot of responsibility on the defense to do a lot of the footwork rather than having her, take the initiative to make sure that Julian Assange is not being violated as far as his human rights go. So that's one thing I wanted to get into. But just to give people a quick summary here of, since we're at the 1 year anniversary, to refresh everyone's memory and let people know about what has happened and why we find ourselves at this extradition of Julian Assange that is still unfolding. Essentially, if you go back to even February 2019, we had Chelsea Manning, who was subpoenaed to appear before the grand jury. She resisted and was promptly jailed, and then she was let out for a week, and she was sent back to jail for refusing to comply with the subpoena. And then she was going to be there indefinitely until the grand jury elapsed. And around that time, you also had Ecuador, because remember, he sought political asylum from Ecuador and was in the Ecuador embassy. You had Ecuador ink a deal with the International Monetary Fund for $4.2 billion in financing to help the country. And it's been strongly suggested that that was connected in some way to Ecuador going forward and expelling Julian Assange from the embassy and allowing the British authorities to come in and arrest Julian Assange. And that happened on April 11th, that he was expelled and arrested. The first charge came down. There was an indictment. It showed that he was charged with a conspiracy to commit a computer crime charge. That all related to Chelsea Manning and his alleged communications with Chelsea Manning. It related to this idea that he may have helped Chelsea Manning crack a password. And you saw that many of the press freedom groups and I suppose human rights organizations that might have been outspoken stayed on the sidelines and weren't very vocal about this, and thought that there might be some grounds for the Justice Department to bring this kind of a case. So there was a lot of work that had to be done to persuade people that this was a negative development. And then May came, and there were 17 charges that were added on to this charge, which, by the way, I've said masquerades as an Espionage Act offense. The computer crime charge is written like an Espionage Act offense. So he's essentially charged with 18 different Espionage Act style offenses, in my opinion. And so in May, he had this superseding indictment, and it was clear that we now had a major case that threatened press freedom. And so nobody could waffle anymore. You saw many press freedom organizations finally take clear stands. And then throughout 2019, you've seen doctors groups come to Julian Assange's defense. You've seen the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Meltzer, issue warnings. There was some back and forth between the Swedish government and the UK government over whether he was now going to be extradited to Sweden over the sexual allegations that had been in the ether for the last 6 or 7 years. And again, that was a case where there were a lot of improprieties. It was, the prosecution was on, then it was off, then it was on, then it was off. And so it was unclear as to why this continued, because there was so much indecision on the part of prosecutors. And there was discussion about whether they were going to pursue extraditing him so that they could actually finally question him in Sweden. Well, they decided not to move forward with that and just let the United States have the opportunity to extradite Julian Assange from the United Kingdom. We then had revelations by July and as well as into September that related to the Spanish security company UC Global about how they were engaged in a massive spying operation on the embassy. that wasn't just against Julian Assange, but was also against lawyers and journalists and visitors, Americans, as well as any Russian visitors that might have been visiting. They were persons of interest to this security company, which was doing this kind of surveillance on behalf of U.S. intelligence agencies. And now there's a major case involving alleged privacy violations or crimes against Julian Assange and his associates that is in the Spanish courts. And as we moved forward in the year, we saw that Jeremy Hammond, who was the hacker who was involved in the leak of the Stratfor files, he was called before the grand jury, and now was another person involved in grand jury resisting this grand jury. We get to 2020. We've now seen this grand jury dismissed. We've had a 1-week hearing in the extradition process for Julian Assange. We've had a chance to see the defense outline its rebuttal for why Julian Assange should not be extradited to the United States. We had that hearing in February. We've seen that the grand jury has now been dismissed. Chelsea Manning is free. Jeremy Hammond is released and is finishing his federal sentence that he was actually supposed to complete before the end of last year and should have been released out of prison. And now, because of that, he's actually vulnerable to the spread of the coronavirus within the Bureau of Prisons system. And so that brings us up to where we are now and how we are headed into, at some point this year, this 3-week hearing that's going to be crucial for Julian Assange as far as bringing witness forward and entering testimony before this judge who's ultimately going to decide whether to authorize the extradition or not.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that was a really great overview, and we will continue to cover this story one way or another, whether it's sending you to London or not. I guess we'll have to take it one day at a time here.
Yeah, and I have to say that that's one thing that really bothered me about the judge's decision is if she's going to go forward with having a hearing in May, I don't know if it's worth taking the risk to fly over there. Being in an airplane that has its own set of risks, going to London when you know that there were authorities in and around Boris Johnson, who is, as far as I know, still going through intensive care because he came down with the coronavirus. And but they made a decision not to immediately shut down the country, and they allowed the coronavirus to spread. So how willing am I to put myself at risk as a journalist, even if I'm just gonna self quarantine, so to speak, and be in a hotel, and then a car going back and forth between the court? Are the courts even going to allow press? And then are they going to allow how many press? How many people do they really want there? The attorneys may not even be at the courthouse. They might actually be litigating it from remote sites where they're joining virtually and doing it that way so that they can protect themselves. So I just, I really prevail, and I wouldn't have to make this choice come the first week of May whether to go or not, because I have a pretty good commitment, a pretty solid commitment to covering this. But I also care about my health, and I don't really want to die from the coronavirus this year.
No. So yeah, we'll take it one day at a time. But yeah, it is unfortunate that it's so unclear right now.
And that's on Vanessa. I mean, there's absolutely no reason why the judge should be doing this to people. And I think you're depriving an accused person who is in the midst of a high-profile case the ability to have public transparency and also participation. I mean, there's lots of supporters that want to attend and maybe can't because of the virus. So I think that's a good place to conclude for this.
Yeah. Let's take it to our next story here involving the EPA. We have a whistleblower, I'm assuming, here telling us the EPA is not on emergency footing despite COVID-19. What's this story?
Yeah, so this comes from a group that I am regularly checking now because I think that they do a good job of keeping tabs on what the Environmental Protection Agency is doing and the way in which Donald Trump's administration is basically selling out the EPA or has sold out the EPA to corporate interests. This is the Public Employees for Environmental Responsibility. And for those at home playing along, last week we talked about deregulation of nuclear waste and how that might be coming to a garbage dump near you, unfortunately. So this group is working to represent environmental whistleblowers in government agencies, as well as public employees themselves who remain a part of these agencies and are doing work that we should consider crucial to protecting our environment. But they say that the EPA is not on an emergency footing like a lot of other agencies, which means that we're seeing things happen that probably should not be taking place, like regulatory rollbacks for clean water, air pollution, etc., that those are being prioritized. We've seen reporting out there about waivers that might be issued to corporations so that they can get away with certain levels of pollution during this pandemic. Peer says that the EPA is, quote, failing to investigate water-related exposures to the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which are present in urine or feces. Exposures may occur where there are combined sewage overflows or when wastewater is reused for irrigation or other purposes. The group goes on to say that the EPA is, quote, slashing investigations and enforcement actions while allowing states to suspend monitoring and discharge limits for industrial polluters, including a new policy to cut civil enforcement during the pandemic. And so, what this means is it's essentially disaster capitalism. This is taking the opportunity to exploit this crisis so that industries can take a load off. I mean, we know a lot of these companies are dealing with the fact that the economy is entirely shut down. So I think as a byproduct of that, you're looking at ways you can cut costs. And obviously, one of the first priorities, if not cutting labor, is going to be, how do I cut the enforcement of these pollution controls? How do I cut back on these? Because it costs to not pollute. And on one hand, we could just have industries that don't pollute. That would probably be the best and most ideal scenario here. But they're going to pollute, and so they have to find a way to manage their emissions, and it's expensive for them to do that. And so that's one of the first things that they want to have to not deal with during this crisis. The statement goes on to further warn that the Trump administration is delaying testing of, quote, forever chemicals, end quote, known as PFAs, which weaken the immune system and make exposed persons more susceptible to life-threatening COVID-19 effects. And if I'm getting this correct, this was actually a part of the focus of the film Dark Waters that came out last year with Mark Ruffalo and the story of the attorney who had challenged these kinds of forever chemicals. Or I think PFAs are similar. I think it was PFOA, but we're talking about the same kind of chemicals. So for people who are trying to place this into their frame of reference, these are kinds of chemicals that once they're released into the environment, they're very hard to get rid of. And they cause really bad effects to human beings. So peer science director, the policy director, Kyle Bennett, who's a scientist and attorney who formerly worked for the EPA, said that the EPA is failing to take a holistic approach to protecting the public health. And overall, EPA's current efforts to safeguard public health are dwarfed by an array of actions to benefit regulated industries. And I'd say that they had been traditionally regulated, but as we've seen more corporate capture of our government agencies, we've seen a weakening of those regulations, in spite of the fact that, not on one hand, you want the environment to be clean so that people can survive and not get ill, but this is all pollution that contributes to the degradation of our environment in a way that is contributing to climate change. So regardless of whether you actually want to do something with your company to protect people, you ought to look out for your own company, because you're making the planet more and more inhabitable, and you won't have an opportunity to make profits, massive profits, if the planet can't support you having your business anymore.
Thank you, Kevin. Let's take this to our last story that we have on deck here. International group condemns attacks on COVID-19 whistleblowers. What's the story here?
This comes from there's a kind of a statement put out by the Whistleblowing International Network, which is a group of 45 different whistleblower protection groups from throughout the world that came together and got behind a letter to send a message to public authorities throughout the world that these institutions need to do a better job of protecting whistleblowers, pointing out that there have been a number of coronavirus whistleblowers who have come forward and exposed how healthcare systems are failing to deliver and take care of people, that there have been issues with procuring supplies that are needed to treat people, that you've seen unfair competition practices and market abuses. When we've seen those kinds of things here in the United States, with states having to bid against each other in order to get supplies, there have been violations of personal privacy rights as well, they say, and that there have even been firings of doctors, scientists, and that frontline workers have been retaliated against for telling the truth. And they mention multiple countries in which you're seeing chills against people who want to engage in public interest speech. And related to this, I'd like to say that OSHA, which is a group that's involved in protecting people who are part of labor, who are working in the workplaces. It's part of the Labor Department in the United States, the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, that they recently put out a statement reminding employers that they are not to retaliate against workers who report unsafe conditions during coronavirus pandemic. And that, in fact, they're allowed to speak to the press about this. There has been at least one case where this was defended in the court, that a person is allowed to go to the press and talk about what's happening in their workplace, and they shouldn't be facing retaliation. It's also possible for someone to go to OSHA and be a whistleblower in the United States. You have a limited amount of time, as my understanding is. It can be somewhere around 30 days after the incident happens to you that you believe was act of retaliation or the thing that you believe you'd like to expose. But you can file it with OSHA, and they can follow up on your complaint, and it could trigger some kind of protection for you so that you can maintain your job in the federal agency or at your workplace. There'd be some limited protection for you during this precarious time. So this group got together and they list several examples, and I'd like to just go over some of them before we wrap our show this week. Which there was one example out in Seattle, Washington. Of course, Washington was one of the first states in the U.S. to be hit really hard by the coronavirus outbreak. And this was Ming Lin, who was an emergency room physician. And Ming was fired because he gave an interview to a newspaper about inadequate protective equipment and testing. In Chicago, Illinois, where I'm based, there's a nurse with asthma who's caring for her elderly father who suffers from a respiratory disease. This was Lori Mazurkiewicz, and Lori was fired by Northwestern Memorial Hospital after emailing colleagues that she wanted to wear a more protective mask while on duty. And she's since filed a wrongful termination lawsuit in, I believe, the Illinois State Court. In New York, you have the NYU, or the New York University Langone health system, that warned employees they could be terminated if they talked to the media without authorization. On Staten Island in New York, we talked about this last week. There was Chris Smalls, who was an Amazon warehouse worker who was fired for saying the company is not doing enough to protect their employees from exposure to the virus. And if we go to London, back where we started the show, talking about Julian Assange in London, the National Health Service has apparently gagged some British health workers from going to the media with their health and safety concerns. India has recently been grappling with the intensifying spread of this virus. In Kerala, India, Shinu Sayamalan was fired for raising concerns about a traveling patient who refused to get tested for the coronavirus. And in Poland, it's mentioned that the former Poland's ruling right-wing law and justice party member of parliament Bernadetta Krynicka and the current MP Grzegorz Wozniak were suspended by the party's president after they spoke out about the state's lack of preparation for the coronavirus. There's also they describe her as a neonatal midwife named Renata Pisanowska, who lost their job at a hospital after raising concerns about the health of herself and her patients on Facebook. So throughout the world, we're seeing examples of these people who are whistleblowers, who are coming forward. Some of them are known people, some of them are unknown. One thing I've done at the end of all of our shows each week is to remind you to look when you're following news coverage, whether it's on cable news or in print news or just online while you're following Twitter and seeing individuals report what they're experiencing on the front lines. Stay on the lookout for whistleblowers, because just about anybody who is speaking about the conditions that they are working in, especially essential workers, this group of people that we really haven't done a good enough job of valuing in our society. They're doing some of the most crucial work during this pandemic, and yet many of them are making minimum wage or very low wages, or some of them are just barely getting what could be considered a living wage. And we know that their work that they're doing is at great risk to themselves. They are wearing masks. They are slowly seeing some responses within industries to caring about them, but this didn't happen immediately. So, some of these people could be coming down with the virus in the past week or two, simply because those corporations, those businesses were not responsive right away to the same degree that you had city governments or state governments respond and try to protect the people's health. And I'm not talking about prisons or jails, because that's an issue in which I think collectively we would agree there's been a failure. But for those businesses and those corporations, you've seen that these essential workers are sacrificing a lot of their safety by reporting to work every day. And if we're talking about people at hospitals or at doctors' offices, there's a lot of risk that they're taking on by reporting for duty. But we know that they have to be there so that we can deal with all of the infections and the people who are who are going into intensive care. And to the extent that there are problems that we need to deal with, we need to listen to them and hear from them and encourage them to speak out and stand up against retaliation and show them solidarity and be there for them. So keep reading that news, keep following broadcasts on television when you see these people, come to their defense, come to their support. I know that there's been some acts of solidarity with nurses in particular. I think there's a time in New York now where people go out and clap because there's been other countries around the world where people celebrate their medical professionals every night if they can, just so that everyone knows that these countries or these citizens actually have their backs during this crisis.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Any final thoughts before we end it today?
Well, no. I know we're going into at least in the U.S. It's a bit of a holiday weekend. Mm-hmm. I'm definitely, if I look forward to what we might be talking about next week, I feel like we might be how certain places were unwilling around Easter, and we've seen these stories of churches that are going to be open and religious services that are going to be happening and gatherings that are probably going to, and it seems like my fear is we're just going to have another uptick in the outbreak. And my guess is that there are going to be some whistleblower stories connected to that. So I'm a little bit dreading, as I imagine that others are, what is going to happen in the next week to 2 weeks. Um, of course, we also had people voting in a primary in Wisconsin, and I think Milwaukee, uh, because of how many people were out there standing in line, I believe like there might be some stories that we might have to tell. There may be a whistleblower who comes forward related to that. But as always, every single week, I thank you for watching this and engaging with these stories and showing Shadowproof support. I realize that this is a really tough time for people and everyone's budgets are getting much tighter. But to the extent that you can support a show like ours, as well as an outlet like Shadowproof, I'm grateful. And I haven't talked a lot about it. I'll be doing some more, but we launched a emergency relief fund first by going to our email list and letting our members know that we were taking some contributions. And I'm going to be doing some matching donation for that because I have some long-term funds available to contribute. But we really wanted to try to put some journalists to work at Shadowproof, give them some pay, but also in the spirit of mutual aid. It's not just charity, it's also solidarity, showing support for them and others by digging into stories that are crucial during this time. And going beyond, just a lot of the stuff that you see on cable news is just people who are officials going on TV and airing the press briefings and bringing those updates to people and then reacting to what they have to say. But having a space to actually dig into some of the more crucial issues involving injustices at the grassroots level that people are confronting, whether we're talking about homelessness or we might be talking about what's happening within the prison system or work stoppages and strikes and resistance that's happening within workplaces in order to make sure that people are protected during this time and also that they don't lose their jobs and continue to be paid, those types of things. So we want to continue to be a space at Shadowproof where we can have that kind of journalism, join other outlets that are doing fine work on this crisis. And, I think, we would be in good company because there's been websites that I've found to be doing fantastic jobs like The Appeal and ProPublica and other places that have done fantastic jobs of covering this during the crisis. And I just want to do our role, do our part that we can, fulfill our role, and invest in some people who are out there that we know would be able to do really incredible work.
Yeah, thank you. And if anyone out there listening wants to support, has a few dollars to chip in, please head over to shadowproof.com/donate. And we'll end it there for the week. Just subscribe to us on YouTube, like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and send us any tips or comments at editor@shadowproof.com. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and be safe and take care of yourselves and each other. And we will see you next week.